This is Jill and Edgar on the front lines. Welcome. For our special guests, we have Tani Ikeda and Michelle Kumata here to tell us about their project of stories of Nikkei farmers. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Hi, I'm Tani Ikeda, and I'm a filmmaker, activist, and served as the creative director on the Emerging Radiance project. It's an AR mural that features 3 of our community's ancestors who were farmers in the Bellevue area. And I drew from my father's 26-year-old oral archive where he and Alice Ito conducted these interviews from the farmers. So in many ways, this has been an incredible family project. I've known Michelle since I was a little girl, and she's a brilliant artist and activist. So this was just a really exciting process to engage in as an artist.
I'm Michelle Kumata. I am based in Seattle, Duwamish land, and my work's influenced by heritage, identity, and legacy. And I'm currently exploring the Japanese diaspora in the U.S. and Brazil. And I am the mural artist for Emerging Radiance. I was commissioned by Meta Open Arts to do this. And I started as one artist working on an office mural, and it grew to bring in Tani Ikeda to include augmented reality. We created a public-facing multimedia art installation. Tani directed an incredible video and also was a visionary for our website. And so there's many more people involved in the project now, and it's growing, and we're excited because we see that people find the relevancy in this project and connect it to people of all ages, backgrounds, and generations.
Yeah, it literally has taken a village to build this project. And we like to say it started with a single seed of a mural and an idea, and it's just grown. And I think that's been such a humbling process for us, because originally when Michelle brought me on and we started this, I think there's this psychic weight of telling the story of your ancestors and not wanting to disgrace your family, and kind of all of these feelings come up. But the way that we are able to tell this community story was by doing it through a community ethos. And, it's not just Michelle and I, so many hands touch this project.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to attend the exhibit, the installation at the Bellevue Art Museum with my friends. And one of them is actually a Japanese American. And she was very, very happy to see, these stories being projected, because a lot of people in the Northwest don't even know about this history of internment of Japanese farmers, or what happened during World War II. People go to the Puyallup Fairgrounds and don't even know that's where people were held, and it's such a part of our history that's been kind of lost or not even really talked about. I guess maybe could you share more about what were some things you learned, or in this process, or some of your motivations?
Well, originally I had been commissioned by Meta Open Arts to create a mural for their offices, and they said you can do whatever you want. And so I wanted to create a site-specific piece, because I knew that land where the Meta campus is was formerly farmland, and that these Japanese families had lived and worked there. And so I wanted to educate the employees of Meta about the history of the land where they were working. And so I started doing that, that piece. And I had shared that I highlighted 9 individuals from the Japanese American farm community. And there's only one person who's still living that's featured in that mural. And so I contacted his son, and his son brought his father in to see the mural. And he said, "This is really wonderful, but we can't, or how can we bring our families here to see this mural?" And so I checked with Meta, and they said, well, because of COVID and because of their security protocols, they couldn't let people in the building. It's really challenging to bring people in to visit the building. And so then we had to think about, well, how can we make it more accessible? And so the folks at Meta Open Arts were very supportive in us creating an actual piece that would be able to be traveling to be displayed in other sites. And then by that time, Tani was also brought on to help. She's like the visionary for the multimedia aspects of it and really bringing it to life. And so it wasn't meant to be this big public facing larger project. It was just meant to be an office mural. But I think that there's a need for people to know this history. People are really excited to learn about this, and it's very empowering for young Asian Americans to see this and learn this history. It's also really enlightening for people who are not Japanese American to see this history and to learn about this. So it wasn't something that was intentionally going to be as big as it has grown to be. So it's been a year journey, and we are really encouraged by all the support and excitement about this piece.
Yeah, and I think for me, I learned a lot about what it takes to be corporately sponsored, to get the funding as artists to create something that is for your community, truly. And so, I think there were a lot of interventions within the conversation that changed the way that this project was being framed. Initially, it was for Meta employees, and at some point the conversation became, well, these are our ancestors, and so this belongs to our community, and we want Meta to essentially give us funding for our own community workshops and to support the farmers from our community today in connection to this story. And so, certain things I kind of see the idea of doing AR as another story intervention, because initially you're just seeing like these gorgeous portraits of our ancestors, but they're not able to speak. They're not able to tell their own story. And so the fact that, now the artwork has the agency to communicate what it is that they experienced feels like, to me now, any mural project that I engage in that features members from our community, I think they can't be silent. They have to be able to share their story. So I feel like that was our first intervention. And then because it was really framed as like, we're creating this artwork and this story for our ancestors, that gave us the power to, I think, really reshape the entire program at Meta Open Arts, and also say, this is what makes sense for Michelle and I, but we also hope that when you engage with other artists of color, who are telling stories from their community, you can also hold a similar frame so that the resources are going back to people in our communities.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the film that you made. It's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. And also, I'd love to share that link in our podcast if it's okay. But can you talk a little bit about that process? Like, how was that structured for you as a filmmaker?
Well, it's interesting because originally there was going to be like a public program where my father, Michelle, and I were going to speak about the experience, but because of COVID, we weren't able to actually hold this event. And so my proposal was, let's use the funding to actually create a film, which will become a living document for us to share these stories, really beyond, Day of Remembrance, which is when this public program was going to be housed. And so again, I think Michelle's name for this project, Emerging Radiance, is exactly how this process of curiosity and growth has really formed. And, that allowed for the film to occur. We documented Michelle throughout the process of her creating the mural. And then I was able to interview my father and other people. And I think one of the components of the film that's revealed is, when you grow up as a Nikkei artist, or just a Japanese American person in Seattle, Washington, you're living with all of the ghosts of our elders and what happened. And I remember, going to the Puyallup Fair with my grandfather because, that's where you get to ride the Ferris wheel and eat cotton candy. And I didn't realize that that's where he was taken and incarcerated. And that place, the Puyallup Fairgrounds, he was living in a horse stall. They called that place Camp Harmony, which is I think it's so disturbing. But growing up, you can live under, I think, sort of all the unspoken stories, and you're surrounded by the pain of that memory, but it's so hard for people to talk to. And I think a lot of our elders just didn't want us to know so that we could have a freer life than they did. And so much of my healing and my education and becoming closer to all the generations of my family has been to, with my camera, reframe, these places and these stories, and to know that, my grandfather, my family members, our elders from who are Nikkei farmers from Bellevue, they don't have to walk with all of that shame. They can be seen by us, the younger generation, and celebrated for their resilience. And so, this whole process has been a way in which, not only are we telling the story of what happened, but we're pointing to all the strategies of resilience that our people created. And I guess that the other thing I would say is, now when we're living in a climate of Stop Asian Hate, unaccompanied children being detained, the mass incarceration of Black folks, there's so many threads in this present moment that echo the experiences of the past in our community. And something that my father always says is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And so by telling the story now and doing it, from people who know it so well and want to honor our elders, I think it's a good way to also create a toolkit or a roadmap for resilience and strategies for organizing as well across communities.
That sounds like I haven't been able to check out the project yet, but just hearing from it sounds like a powerful experience to go and witness it. And so thank you for sharing that. As artists, I think artists play an important role in movement building, and again, bringing up those stories that sometimes want to get pushed down or invisibilized. So, I think that's, a different way of telling a story that many people can relate across all generations, because, art is forever. And it cuts across cultures and reminds us, even if we're not, from the same backgrounds or anything, but it reminds us of something within ourselves. So thank you for that. I guess some of my questions, that have been brought up just hearing this discussion. First, I am not familiar with the term Nikkei. I don't know if I pronounced it right, but if you could explain a little bit about what that means. And my second question was the journey of Japanese farmers is not a history that I'm not familiar with, or the Japanese community into, the Northwest, I guess. And if there's something that, you could share about how that looked like, about who were the first people, or kind of like why people chose like Bellevue or the Northwest to farm. Yeah.
So Nikkei is a Japanese word for the diaspora, the Japanese diaspora. And so we use it to encompass Japanese immigrants living in the US, as well as people who are born here, Japanese Americans too. So it's a little more encompassing than saying Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. And then in terms of like the history in the Northwest and the Bellevue area, there were white settlers who came here, and they saw, Bellevue was this lush forest area before with old growth trees. And so they came here because of the timber, the resources. And so they started cutting down the trees. And so there were all these stumps left. And then Japanese immigrants started coming into the Bellevue area in the late 1800s. And the white landowners would offer the Japanese immigrants 5-year leases on these plots of land that was covered with the old growth stumps. And so they give them 5 years to use the land, but they'd have to remove the stumps. And so they had to use dynamite, and, it'd take years for them just to remove the stumps. And then they'd have maybe 2 or 3 years to actually use the land as farmland. And then their lease would be over, and they'd have to move on to another plot of land and start all over again. So meanwhile, they're doing this, they're working this land and moving, and they're making that land very valuable in Bellevue. So, and then because of the alien land laws, the Japanese immigrants were not able to own land, so they had to lease land, or they would get around that law by purchasing the land in their American-born children's names so that they could have the land. And then in the 1920s, Japanese American farmers in Seattle and King County, they supplied 75% of Seattle and King County's produce and 50% of the milk supply. So they became really successful. But then after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Nikkei in the US were looked upon as the enemy. And then President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which resulted in the forced removal and incarceration of 120,000 innocent Nikkei, which included the Bellevue Japanese American farmers. And they were unjustly incarcerated even though no one was guilty of any crimes, and they were not given any trials or hearings. And so they had to move to these temporary camps. So a lot of people went to the Puyallup Fairgrounds, where they were housed temporarily, and they could only take what they could carry. So if they didn't have storage or someone to take care of their homes or farms or property, they had to quickly sell everything they had for pennies on the dollar. Before World War II, there were 60 Japanese American families in Bellevue. And then after the war, only a dozen families returned. And when they returned, they still, they faced racism and discrimination. And actually, Alice Ito, whose parents grew up in Bellevue, she talked about how her parents returned to Bellevue after the war. They wanted to purchase a home, but no realtor would show them homes in Bellevue. And then Kyo Yabuki, who's also featured in the mural, he served in the 442nd Infantry, which was a segregated all Japanese American unit. And he received a Purple Heart for his service. And when he returned home, he brought his military uniform to a dry cleaner, and they refused service to him. And there's also Kimitomo Muramoto, who's the only living person that's featured in the mural. And he also served in the 442nd Infantry. And he had this quote of, "We fought two wars, the war against Germany and Japan and the war against prejudice." And so when they came back, they didn't feel like, oh, great, we're home again, they weren't welcome back. And so I think that's a lot of this is oppressed history that a lot of people don't hear about or know about. And like Tani was saying, our elders and our ancestors didn't always talk about this because they were ashamed, or they were trying to protect the younger generation from having to carry this burden. They also wanted us to assimilate and blend in so we wouldn't have to face what they had to face. Even being someone who maybe you didn't grow up with these stories or this history, but I think that it's kind of a tragedy that we don't know this history, or a lot of people didn't grow up knowing this history or learning it firsthand from their ancestors, that all this time and all these years they've been holding this in. And there are a lot of stories that we'll never know because so many of these people have passed on. So this is a way to honor those stories and, to finally share these stories with a broader public and with our community.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Do you know if the Emerging Radiance will do another run? I was telling folks about it, but then it was already finished. And then,
it's actually going to be not the whole farmhouse won't be there, but the walls of the farmhouse will be on display at Augment Seattle, which is an augmented reality festival, August 12th through 28th. And I'll send you the information for that. We're also trying to confirm other exhibitions of the piece too. So there are things in the works.
One thing about the history, when you look at the story of the Nikkei farmers in Bellevue, there's also a very clear nemesis and legacy of institutionalized violence. Miller Friedman was a businessman and former military officer who, essentially was very vocal in enacting the alien land laws. And then in the 1940s, when it became clear that Bellevue was high property value because of the Nikkei farmers, a bridge was actually implemented from Bellevue to Seattle. And so before that point, it was really hard to actually get to go around the entire lake before you could actually access all of this produce. And so all of a sudden the bridge, the floating bridge, made it a 15-minute drive. And so this increased the property value of Bellevue. And so, when the bombing of Pearl Harbor happened, Miller Friedman was one of the most outspoken advocates to round up those Japanese American families from Bellevue and have them incarcerated. And so, Seattle, Washington, or Washington State is really the first place that Japanese Americans were incarcerated. And then Arkansas were incarcerated all down the West Coast. And so, like Michelle said, only 12 families returned to Bellevue after the war. And, when you ask what happened to that land, well, today in Bellevue, many of you may know that the Friedman family owns majority of property. Miller Friedman's grandson, Kemper Friedman, owns the Bellevue Square and a number of, I think, kind of well-known real estate in the area. And so in my mind, this is also very much the legacy of white supremacy and violence that was done to our community. And, there are other artists and community members who have tried to talk about this very clearly defined component of what happened to our communities and how that lives on really through the story of the land and who owns it. And they have been censored in present day from talking about this with the media. And Erin Shigaki, who's another muralist, created a mural specifically talking about the Miller Friedman family, and the words on her mural were actually whited out. And so, I think this is also really important that people have a very specific historical example of institutionalized violence and white supremacy, so that, we're able to, I think, really talk about how it impacts communities across decades and generations.
Woke from a dream in which you'd left me posing for cars on the American stoop. Don't make me beg you just 'cause you can. I'm just one man with loneliness. I'm just one man with needs. And how could you ever conceive how much I need you, how truly barren I can be? They say that time, it is the only certainty, but it's been 1 o'clock for hours. Oh, the day is long and tangling. Cancer release from what
Welcome back. We're here talking to Tani and Michelle about their project, Emerging Radiance. They were just explaining a little bit about the history of the Nikkei farmers and Bellevue and art and community. So welcome back. I to kind of like again before we jump into the other topic, just in general, what has been your observations of the reaction from the public in viewing the project?
One thing that sticks out in my mind is when the piece, The Farmhouse, was on display at the Bellevue Arts Museum. Tani and I led a workshop for youth, and we did an art workshop with them, and then we did a tour of the farmhouse. And a lot of the youth that are in this group are Asian American, and I was talking to them about how I used gold and yellow for the skin tones of the portraits. For one thing, is to honor the individuals, but then the yellow and gold also represents the racism that these people faced and how they were viewed and targeted, and then also how now we continue to be viewed and targeted as yellow people and as foreigners. And then how we can use that color to represent how we can own our heritage and history. So it was really sweet because one of the students came up and talked to me, and she said how much it meant for her to see or feel like her image and she was being represented through this piece. Like she was able to feel like she was being seen. And so for me, that was really powerful to have this young person come up and tell me how this made her feel, how it made her feel proud and seen. So.
Yeah, I think that was a powerful moment to be in dialogue with youth. And something that was also shared is this is a particular moment in our living history that has a lot of uncertainty, I think, especially for young folks. And so, we talked about the different interventions of storytelling. There's a film, there's we use QR codes to create an experience that was very accessible to anyone who has an Instagram. You can record one of the filters of our elders telling their stories and then remix it and post it to your peers. There's the physical art mural itself as an installation, and then the AR microsite for anyone who's not physically at the space to experience it. And so, we're fortunate to have resources and partnerships with Meta to create all of these different forms of telling the story. But what we really wanted the youth to know is you can tell your story by any means necessary. So if you have a camera, you can film your story. If you don't have that, you have a paintbrush, you can paint your story. If you don't have that, you have a body, you can still express your story by any means necessary. And so really it's with the urgency to get the story out there that we are creating in this moment. And as an art intervention, I think for a lot of our community members who, are activists, we really want to make the movement like desirable and sexy and like fun and something that people want to engage with, because the work, and all of you are organizers, like the work is so hard and can feel very hopeless. And so, in order to get people to engage in a story that is painful, and a collective history that people can still engage in today through organizations like Sudo for Solidarity, who are, our elders and other community members from the Nikkei community are fighting to shut down present day detention centers that many of our elders actually were taken to as children. In order to sustain our momentum, like the process, I think, has to feel full of hope and remind us who we are and what our vision is. And that's, I think, where artists come in to make the work feel so full of our freedom dreams that people can't help but want to participate and engage. And so, I think another powerful moment for me is when my grandparents came, and everybody in the mural, they're all people who they grew up with. They pointed to different portraits and said, that's so-and-so, and it was like their nickname. And so, my grandmother, who has never shared her story, and this is emotional for me because since I was 6 years old, my father has been documenting all the stories of the elders from our community. And it's a 26-year-old archive now. So as long as I've been alive, he's been trying to tell this story. And now Densho is the largest oral history archive in the world. So I'm very proud of his work, but his mother has never let him interview her. So after she saw this exhibition, she told my father and I that she was ready to tell her story. And for me, that was like the most emotional thing for me, because, utilizing technology, I'm standing on the shoulder of my father and his work, and his, the legacy that he's built telling our community stories. But, through AR, now it's something that we can share to the next generation. But really, it comes down to family. Like this is a family story of how our family was torn apart. And I think there was just like this huge moment of completion when my grandmother said that she was ready to tell her story.
That's really beautiful. And yeah, I totally agree that art and culture are it is the heart of movement work. Without it, yeah, how can the movement continue? So I thank you for your gifts, because yeah, it is really hard work, and through your project, through your art, through your stories, it can really inspire more and more people to come forward, like your grandma, and it is a really beautiful thing because we can't let the movement die, and it will live on. Yeah, just thinking about all the difficult things. Like my parents are similar too. They didn't want to talk about what happened in the Philippines during martial law, not until like later in their life. And by then, it's like, yeah, I wish I had a tape recorder. I wish I was able to, get those stories. But now they just live in my head. Yeah. And so I think, yeah, there's something about like the intergenerational like connection too, because there will always be like another generation of young folks who want to like change the world. And how do we like talk to like not miss out on talking with our elders to learn the history, learn the lessons, give each other strength. I think that, projects like this facilitate that kind of connection. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, something else I want to say is I think I learned a lot about sort of the parallel healing journey of our elders and the youth that were happening simultaneously. And they both felt like almost a, I don't know, like a coming of age trajectory that was happening at the same time. Because for our elders to work with storytelling, to tell their story. And again, a lot of the elders who are still living, they were babies, they were children in the camps. And then they also testified in the 80s about their experience to get reparations for our government and win reparations. And so in many ways, they have been schooled to tell their own stories and their family stories for other people. And so now I think what we're doing through art and narrative strategy in collaboration with so many young people is to tell the story for ourselves and for our community and letting other people into that process, which I think is a different way of telling our story. And it's created more of a sense of wholeness, I think, and finally in like the later years of our elders' lives who are in their 80s and 90s to come full circle in being able to share what happened. And the younger generation who are also coming of age in a time of great disruption and I think hate to also share their own stories. So to me, what was powerful, it wasn't just our elders imparting wisdom to the young people. It was like this very emergent process of growth and transformation that everybody is kind of on a parallel journey experiencing. And that's not something that I guess expected, but was powerful to bear witness to in the process.
It's really beautiful what you're talking about. It reminds me of some of the youth programs we've been able to have in the past and hopefully will again. We had a community garden space where kids could come and learn about growing food and cooking food. And unfortunately that we lost that space. But that process that you're talking about, I remember, just getting those lessons from farm workers of like, what is the best way to pick these blueberries, or what are we going to do with this corn that we grew, or any of those things. It's a way for young people to interact in a thing that that otherwise gets lost right along the way. So hopefully we'll be able to do that again. But one thing I noticed with this butterfly project too, which, our project was in part inspired by Pseudo for Solidarity and the way that they had organized around, it was like more than 100,000 cranes. I'm trying to remember the number, from all across the country to be sent to these detention centers in Texas, right? That's where the idea for our project came from. But I noticed we were at a community picnic this last weekend that was talking about food sovereignty and food security, and the families who were participating. These stories are hard. You're talking with children who maybe haven't heard about detention centers before and migration. Like most of the kids in the neighborhood we were in know about migration because it's a pretty diversely represented area. But what is hard about that is talking about what is still happening. What has always happened in this country is like the detention, the incarceration of folks who are families and who get separated and all these things. But I noticed, especially for the younger kids, to keep moving their hands. So they didn't really want to be, they're thinking through these stories and asking these questions, but they have something else to be doing. And that I think is really powerful too about the art of origami, is like, just allow yourself to put that energy into something, and then to be able to give it like Pseudo for Solidarity does as a gift. It's also a protest. It's also a noticing of, like, in our case, we see that the city is ignoring the needs of thousands of people in our community, and we want to bring attention to that, but we also want people to interact with it. So I just kind of wanted to ask you about your thoughts about that, because obviously it's a borrowed art form. So sort of interested in how that lands.
Well, kind of what you're saying reminds me of a workshop that I participated in and documented as somebody who is working very closely with Patrice Cullors, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, and the movement. There was a workshop with undocumented folks and families to talk about, if you are detained, what do you do? What is the process? You know, and how, and there were so many children who were there who were taking the workshop, because how do you explain to a 2 or 3-year-old why your mother's being taken, or in that moment, when ICE comes and you're taken, how do you explain that to a child? And it was a very emotional workshop, because on the one hand, you're giving information to the parents and the adults, but at the same time, you're trying to figure out how do you prepare a child potentially for something like this. And I think art interventions can be a point of continuity, because I also, you know, in addition to the cranes that Studio for Solidarity are creating, and the butterflies that people are folding, the origami butterflies, you know, when you find out what the lives are like of the children who are in detention centers, some of them are actually using paper to create, you know, during when they can, when they're afforded to create some kind of art. And so again, I think of it like a strategy of resilience, because, you know, people like my grandfather, who was incarcerated, and then for protesting his incarceration, and not being willing to join a segregated army, the 442nd, he was then taken to McNeil Island Penitentiary, to do something with your hands. And he was an artist, was really kind of life-sustaining for him. And so in some ways, for Studio for Solidarity, when you're involved in the practice of folding crane after crane with colorful paper, and know that there are people across the country doing the same thing, there are people who are inside who are doing the same thing, it does create this feeling like you are a part of something and supported by something that's much larger. And again, maybe there's like folklore or this kind of magical feeling about it. I know when I was a little girl, I tried to fold 1,000 cranes, because once you fold your 1,000th crane, your wish is granted. And so it is like this feeling of, we wish with all of our hearts that, you know, detention centers didn't exist and didn't impact our families the way it's impacted us for generations. And so the simple act of folding a crane, which really, you know, it's like, on the one hand, you're like, it doesn't do anything. There's no magic in it. You know, you're just killing time, or you're just like idly doing something because of your anxiety. But, you know, I think because there's also this children's story that it's attached to, about it essentially making you freer, and granting your wish, and to know that there are so many people who are folding with the intention of getting children and their families out of detention centers. There's a physicality to that particular art intervention. And when the cranes are carried from protest to protest and hung on the actual fences, you know, I'm reminded that cranes and all kinds of birds and butterflies migrate freely. You know, everything in nature migrates, and it's not criminalized. That's the man-made thing. That's the thing that our governments are doing that is unnatural. But what is natural, and everything in nature will tell you this, is to move and to transform, and to travel. So I think it's been a powerful symbol. And there's also cranes in Michelle's mural that help direct you to, you know, the direction that you should move in the progression of the story. And so it is something that, we've tried to build and keep that visual continuity as artists in the movement, just so people know that, and especially children, can remember that their experience of migration is natural.
Yeah, I'm still gathering myself, but I do think, yeah, this has been it's been really great hearing you share your stories. I'm hopeful that our more and more people will come to learn this history and or seek it out. I think that in this area, especially the Northwest, the Coastal Sea area, there's a lot of trauma on this land. There's a lot of unspeakable things that should be spoken or learned about. And it will take time. And I think about like how this land here, like a lot of us are looking to seek healing from working and healing the land, and also healing ourselves in that process. So looking forward again to more and more people coming to learn more about your project and about the history of Nikkei farmers. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And also again, thank you for taking time and talking to us here. And again, for the folks that didn't listen, do you want to repeat the date of the exhibit and where it's going to be? And also, if you want to give out like where people can find you, like your website or your Instagram or social media, that'd be great.
So the next showing of Emerging Radiance will be at Augment Seattle, and it's in South Lake Union. This piece will be at the 9th and Thomas building. And I think it's probably best to look up the Augment Seattle website. I know they're on Instagram also. And it's August 12th through 28th. I'll try to look up all the information and share it with you too. So you'll have it, the correct information for that. And then I'm on Instagram, Michelle Kumata, at Michelle Kumata.
And you can follow our project on Instagram at Emerging Radiance. And my personal Instagram is at Tani Ikeda. And you can also follow my work on taniikeda.com. This was wonderful. Thank you.